Hello, welcome to the podcast of Startup Recruitment Failures. I'm Indra, founder and CEO of Job Rely. We are building AI for outbound recruitment. And today, my guest is Kunal Gupta, founder at Nova. Kunal, could you please introduce yourself and your company?
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for having me on. It's nice to be connected again. Nova is a company that I founded 16 years ago, before it was cool to start tech companies out of school. And
Mhm.
it's a B2B advertising software business that's quite mature today, with 300 clients in 30 countries and team members all over the world.
Great. And how many people are working there?
The team is 65 today. And over the years, some moments it's been larger or smaller, and that's the team size today.
So the team, is it based in Canada or it's also spread it throughout all the countries where your clients are?
Well, in the last couple of years post pandemic, it's continued to spread more and more. I personally am
Yeah.
living in Portugal now. The
Okay.
company
Even
is
you moved.
yeah, the
Okay.
company is a Canadian company. That's where I started it. We have people probably in 4 or 5 different cities across the U.S., probably 4 countries across Europe, and Australia as well.
Okay, that's awesome. So I guess you have quite a lot of experience with recruitment and managing people you hired and onboarded on your team.
Yeah, I was telling somebody the other day, I think I've personally hired 700 people now
Nice.
as the hiring manager in the last 15, 16 years, plus all the other people that I wasn't directly involved with, but responsible
Mhm.
for.
Great, great number. So, is there anything important or maybe like worth talking about so you could share with the other startup founders and recruiters?
It's really hard. It's really, really hard. Would you like me to talk about, the what I've learned through mistakes or what I've learned through successes? Where do you want me to start?
Mistakes, maybe let's start with the mistakes. And if you have an example of a case where you hired and you had to admit that there's no match actually, and you need to separate.
Sure. So a case that comes to mind is one from the early stages of the business. I was 22 years old. Business was just getting started. Our team had um, probably like 15 people at that time.
Okay,
Couple
nice.
million in revenue. A product that finally was working, and some traction. Up until that point, I was the only salesperson in the whole company, and brought in a VP of sales.
Mhm.
And the number of mistakes I made with this one individual in this one role, there's many. So I learned a lot of lessons, not just one lesson. I learned a lot of lessons from this one experience. So let me start with how I met the candidate. He wasn't a candidate. I was at a tech entrepreneur dinner. And this is a long time ago now, so those things were rare when they happened. And he was sitting beside me, and he was living in the US. I was living in Canada, but he was Canadian originally. So we just kind of hit it off at an individual level, at a personal level. And he was sharing me more about his journey. And he's sharing that he really was helping, companies with sales, and he had worked for a number of big companies that sounded impressive on his
Mhm.
resume. And I was like, yeah, I'm looking for a head of sales. Do you want to come on board? And
Okay, that was easy.
that was the extent of it. So that was one lesson learned, is actually interview people, not just, you know, I hired basically based on the resume. Number one, based on personality, which in sales, everybody has a good personality in sales. So, because that was my first time hiring in sales, I didn't realize that it's hard to hire salespeople because they're good at selling themselves.
Exactly. And I think what really is important to mention here is the first impression, because the first impression actually matters, but it doesn't matter as much as we sometimes might think. And I remember when I was a recruiter, we were practicing this thing of like entering the meeting room with a candidate. Having already from the first minutes, actually, the first impression, writing it down and then forgetting about it for the
Hmm.
last interviewing part, and just then to compare the answers you got and how are they matching with the requirements and what was the first impression, right? Because it's only of the factor actually you should consider. But I can understand you that it's like, especially with salespeople, and if you want to basically to take your own responsibilities and to find someone, it really matters that there's like uh, personal bond, and maybe this worked in your case.
Yeah, I'd say that, yeah, there are three things I learned from this first part of the lesson. One is I looked at only the resume. Two, uh, looked at, yeah, the first impression, and the friendliness and the, I'm not even going to say chemistry, just compatibility. And the third was nothing to do with the candidate, but more me, and that was like, I need a salesperson. So it's a problem that I need to be fixed, and maybe not feeling confident, maybe not feeling patient. Entrepreneurs, especially in the early stage, we're
Yes.
all very impatient
Yes.
and more excited to just check the box than to do it well.
Mhm.
So those are kind of the three things I learned at that first part of bringing somebody on is uh, and now fast forward 15 years, I obviously do it completely differently.
Mhm. But
uh,
why it was a failure? So maybe sometimes it could work, right? When did you notice that something is not right or not as you have expected?
yeah, so this is like the failure that kept giving. It kept giving
Mhm.
lessons. So what I didn't clue into was that my new head of sales wasn't actually making any sales, and I was continuing to be the only salesperson in the company, even though I was paying him, and he was US based and very expensive. And for everybody, the Canada US currency at the time wasn't very good, so hiring somebody in the US was really expensive from a Canadian perspective, from a currency perspective. So the second failure in the same experience was having somebody that wasn't actually making any sales, and I was still the one involved with every single deal. He, to his credit, he did open some doors and do some lead gen, that I was able to close. But he was a senior guy, like head of sales. But I didn't hold him accountable. I didn't give him a hard time. I didn't ask any hard questions. I did not manage him. Um, and as a result, he's costing a young vulnerable business a bunch of money, and not delivering the results. I think what was actually worse was that he didn't really understand our business.
Mhm.
And I mean, this is 15 years ago, so asynchronous communication, remote cultures, Zoom didn't exist. So he's sitting in San Francisco, we're all sitting in Toronto, so literally a 6-hour flight away. And then he started bringing us into potential clients that were not good clients at all and were completely off the mark.
Mhm.
And the reason I bring that up as a failure is at that early stage, it actually became a big distraction.
Mhm. Of
Um,
course, yeah, I can imagine. But why do you think you were not managing him? Was it because you were afraid to give some criticism or and to demotivate? What were the reasons why you were like still patiently waiting and still having no result?
so I know this is a podcast, so you can't see me smiling, Indra, but the thought did not even cross my mind. Like, that's how naive and inexperienced I was. Is
Okay.
I was completely clueless. I didn't even see him as distracting and not performing for us. I
Hmm.
just was trusting and patient and assumed in a very naive way. that uh, it's working. And the business was doing well, but it was because of me on the sales side and the team on the product side.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like success paints over mistakes. So the business was growing, revenue was growing, um, but this role was not contributing at all.
What is your management style nowadays? So you learned quite a lot of lessons. I believe you tried like different kind of management styles. Which one do you prefer now?
So number one is to hire the right people, and that's absolutely critical. And during the hiring process, that involves obviously properly doing diligence and interviewing and referencing the candidate. But I spend a good amount of time now in my hiring process setting expectations, setting expectations in terms of what it's like to work for me as a leader, as a manager, setting expectations of what's expected of the job and the role, what they're walking into from a culture perspective, even setting expectations of the warts and the challenges and the issues in the business. So I put everything on the table in the interview process before they sign, before an offer is made, to see how do they react and how do they respond
Hmm.
to all of it. So that's like my management style. Like number one is recruit well and en- almost engage people in the business before they even have an offer, so they understand extremely well. And for me, it's a way to pick up, do they understand? Because if they can't understand it in the interview process with me sharing all this information, they're not going to understand it once they start.
Hmm.
So that's like number one. Number two is from a management perspective is being very clear like where we're headed and why. So vision and strategy.
Yeah.
And there's we're in the advertising and marketing space, as you're saying, is that people need to hear something six times
Hmm.
before it resonates. And I find in management it's 27 times.
Okay.
And it sounds slightly different every time, but it's ultimately getting to the same message. So being very, very clear as to what's important in the business. So clarity of vision, clarity of strategy, clarity of the why behind it, and making sure there's no doubt whatsoever as to why we exist and how we're approaching the opportunity ahead of us. And then number three, so one is recruit well, number two is communicate well, and then number three is actually to get out of the way. Because if I've done one and two well, then number three, from an execution standpoint, takes care of itself. So I've become less and less hands on over the years. As I've learned how to recruit better and communicate better, it involves me actually doing less, not more, in terms of the execution and giving people the trust to step into the role.
Hmm. What about monitoring the results and giving the feedback then?
Yeah, I'm very big on feedback, very, very big. And that's one of the expectations I share with people when I hire them
Okay.
is I ask them, how do you take feedback? And everybody says, yeah, I take it well, I want it. And
Of course.
I ask, okay, give me an example in your professional or personal life where you've received feedback in the last week.
Hmm.
And then I see how long does it take them to come up with something.
Hmm.
And then it almost gets a bit into therapy. It's like, and then I ask them, like, how did you feel receiving that feedback?
Yeah.
How did you respond? Were you defensive? Were you open? Were you appreciative? And a friend told me this to me once, and it stuck with me that feedback is a gift. It's a gift to
Hmm.
give. It's a gift to receive. And we have different processes inside the company to um, make giving and receiving feedback more systematic and regular and consistent, but
Hmm.
still fun and interesting in a way that hopefully is vulnerable. So I give a lot of feedback, and I also ask for a lot of feedback. Um,
Hmm.
and
When you
uh,
say to give a feedback in a fun way, and especially if it's a negative one, what do you mean? Could you give an example?
yeah, so there are times when it's like the feedback was so obvious to me, like they made a presentation that was terrible, or
Hmm.
they built a product that like there was clearly a big bug. So I asked them, and almost a bit leading question, like, "Hey, how do you think that went?"
Hmm.
Almost with a bit of a smile on my face. And nine times out of 10, they'll just come clean and they'll be like, "That was terrible."
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
And then I'm like, you're right, it was terrible. And we laugh about it. And we acknowledge the elephant in the room. And that's about creating the space that people feel safe to, like, it's so obvious, let's just acknowledge it out loud, versus dancing around or tiptoeing around and not actually being clear and open.
Mhm.
Well,
Did you have a situation that the person did not understood from the first or even later stage that it's not a good result and basically didn't accept your feedback?
not on the obvious things, but the more subtle things, yes. And what I've learned from that is it's an expectation misalignment. So definitely have had many cases where um, we share, like, hey, how did this went? It went well. And like, I don't think it actually went that well, and here's why. And I'm like, well, I don't agree, or here's why what I thought was expected. And in those cases, what I will do when I remember, and hopefully it's more often than not, is take responsibility and say, I take responsibility. I did not clearly communicate the expectations that I had
Hmm.
on this specific project. And I will commit to, in the future, making more effort to make the expectations clear. And I will ask of you that if there's any doubt that you have about what the expectations are, that you take responsibility to ask for clarification.
Hmm.
And that's gone over well. That goes over well.
Okay,
When I
yeah.
take
If you
responsibility.
if you do it in a polite way and also taking the responsibility for maybe miscommunicating your expectations. So, of course, I think it's really a matter how you present this feedback, not whether it's good or negative. And yeah, I'm a fan of the feedback. It's so important. I believe that only getting feedback we can learn and grow. Otherwise, how do we know where we could improve, right?
Yeah, completely.
And in your case, so with the first VP of sales you hired, so how long did it take for you? For how long were you patient, and when did you decide that it's really not working?
So here's kind of the third part of that lesson. So the first
Hmm.
part was hiring off a dinner conversation. The second part was being naive and oblivious to the lack of sales and performance.
Hmm.
And then the third part was uh, we did a Series A, raised 6 million. This was a long time ago, and uh, went through obviously the diligence process. Had lots of VCs and term sheets. So a lot of people were looking at the business. I wasn't just one investor.
Hmm.
Um, so we went through diligence with a lot of people. So a lot of people met this VP of sales.
Okay.
And then after we closed with the lead investor, we closed literally the first meeting I had with them. We are like high fived and like excited to work with each other. And they're like, you need to get rid of your head of sales.
Okay. Wow.
And I was like, really? Why? They're like, we weren't going to say this to you during diligence, but it's obvious to us that you can do better
Hmm.
than what you have. And I was like, tell me more. And they're like, he doesn't have a pipeline. And I'm like, what's a pipeline?
Okay.
and and they just like showed me like their diligence, and that they opened my eyes to like, oh, this is what a VP of sales is supposed to do and what you can expect of them.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, it's just that one conversation. I was like, okay, we're gonna fire him. So the next day, again, he's in San Francisco. I'm in Toronto. I call him and I let him go.
Hmm.
And um, and then he was disappointed. He wasn't mean, but he just kind of actually was very quiet. And it was suspicious because salespeople are very talkative.
Hmm.
He was very quiet.
Hmm.
And then 3 days later, I get a letter from a lawyer saying he's suing us
Oh, wow.
for, I think it was, I'm going to say 50,000 USD, which at the time was a lot of money. And it was a lot of money for us. And in the US, still to this day, there's a lot of contingency based lawyers where for executive roles, they'll say, hey, you got fired. Let's go sue your former employer. And you don't have to pay us as a legal firm unless we're successful in helping you win. And the thing is, with like a $50,000 suit, is that it's cheaper to settle than to fight it in court.
Yes, of course.
So it's like it's a very strategic number. um, is that it's big enough to be meaningful for the individual, but it's small enough that it's lower than the legal cost. There's absolutely no basis for the claim. I don't even remember what was in the claim. Um, but it was like, wow, like I didn't hire well, I didn't manage well, and I didn't even fire well, like the entire process. So, needless to say, I mean, I've hired hundreds, and probably fired hundreds as well over the 15 years, and that's never happened again. So, that that experience felt costly at the time, but actually looking back was not, because I've learned so much from it, and I was able to apply those learnings over 15 years of a career as a CEO, and lots of hiring and managing and firing as well.
Yeah, I actually had a similar situation, and I remember the feeling that first of all it was a shock, because it was mutual agreement, you imagine, and finally you get a lawsuit, and it's very important to deal with your ego, because if you would like to prove you're right, it can cost even more in comparison to settle. So it's very important, I think, to be very pragmatic, and just, of course, to be disappointed, but not to try to prove something, because it's if the person did that, so they are already against you and will try to seek, and make and take even more energy from you as it was.
Yeah, yeah, completely. There is, I mean, in so many things with managing people or being a founder or entrepreneur, there is a big ego element involved. I mean, an entrepreneur is trying to prove themselves. Literally, that's the definition of a startup. We have an idea and we're trying to prove that it is valuable. And that mindset of proving oneself is um, it proliferates in every part of the business. So it's like, I made this hire, and then I want to prove that I made the right hire,
Exactly.
even if they're not the right hire, or like I built this
Yeah.
product, or I got this deal, or whatever it is. So the more and more, with more age and experience, I've had much more humility to openly talk about all of the failures. Case in point today, and that's that humility to accept when I was wrong and the assumptions I made have changed is kind of the secret of my entrepreneurial success. The ability to adapt, which is to
Exactly.
let go of what I thought was true and accept what is now true.
Exactly, to be very agile and exactly to adapt, as you say, to every situation and not to prove at everyone, right? Because what is very important is also to fail fast. If you are prolonging it every day, it costs more and more. And so, Kunal, what to conclude? What would be one thing if a startup founder comes to you and asks, like, for one main, most important advice? What it would be like? How would you advise a person who just started building their team?
I'm going to share two pieces of advice. So one is for the business, and the second is for talent. So on the business, this point that we just made, it's like being adaptable
Hmm.
and being able to recognize the signals and the information from mainly the market of whether what you're doing is working or not working, and be willing to adapt. That's the secret of my success for sure. And then as it relates to building a team and hiring and managing and firing, trusting your gut. And I know it's cliche, and I know you've heard it before, but in the first few minutes of meeting someone, you develop a first impression, and then as you spend more time, that either impression gets validated or invalidated.
Yeah.
And just to really trust how you're feeling about people, and let that be a big piece of information that you consider when you make decisions.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Kunal, for your time and sharing your learning. And thank you to all the listeners. If you like this, please leave your review on Spotify. And for more podcasts, please visit jobrely.com.